Hi guys, welcome back to the channel. So a trans-identified male has been allowed to compete in the Women's National Water Polo Championships for a second time. Now the reason why this is so important is that when you start allowing biological males to compete in women's sports, it makes that particular sport worthless. That particular competition, that division, whatever you want to call it, it just completely ruins the integrity of the competition, the integrity of the sport. And I don't understand why it's acceptable to do this to women's categories. So this person is a chess champion, apparently, a women's chess champion, despite being male. There are women categories when it comes to sports, and there are men's categories. If it's a mixed category, that's one thing. But if it's a women's category, no male should be allowed to play simply because of identity. Doesn't matter whether there's an unfair advantage or not. Obviously with chess, it's a lot different when it comes to that debate. But regardless, women's categories need to be protected. They need to remain integral. We can't have that when we start saying that people can identify as a woman and be in that category. There should be a separate category for people who identify as, anything different from the sex that they were born. So this person is now called Alicia, and this person is at the University of Michigan and is a member of the women's water polo team. So Alicia is going to the national championships on the women's team. So Paans, 31, is expected to appear at the 2024 National Collegiate Water Polo Championships, which will be held from May 3 to 5 at Texas A&M University. The competition includes 16 US-based teams vying for the women's national title in their sport. Paan's first game will be against Texas State University on May 3. So this weekend, this person is set to play at a national event in the women's category. The women who are going to compete against this person at Texas A&M, for example, they don't get a say. Remember, Leah Thomas, Paula Scallon was on the same team as Leah. And people like to imply that as a woman, you should be happy to have a trans athlete on your team because your team will have an advantage.
Because Leah Thomas didn't wake up one morning and suddenly decide, I'm going to be able to win in the women's category, so I'm going to
That's
switch.
exactly what she's doing.
That's not what happened.
That's what she's doing.
Leah Thomas, she is a woman, and so she is competing as a woman.
She's a trans woman.
She is a woman.
She's a trans woman.
We can go back and forth on
She's
this.
a trans woman born with a biological male body, which gives her an immediate, massive advantage over women who weren't.
So why aren't other members of her team happy that they're finally winning and qualifying for all of the things that they never qualified for
because
before?
they can all see that it's unfair.
Is it not a little bit of jealousy?
No, it's just they know that at some stage Leah Thomas is going to probably win the Olympic gold medal.
Oh no, that would be awful for America.
Yeah,
that would be terrible.
It would be
That in itself is acknowledging the unfair advantage that male athletes have over women. But that's not how someone like Paula Scallon saw it. She didn't care for the fact that she had to change in a locker room with a male athlete. And she didn't like what was happening to her fellow women, her fellow female athletes. Every female athlete should be against this because, again, it's devaluing your sports because it's no longer based on fair competition. It's based on gender ideology that's not rooted in reality. And when it comes to sports like water polo, swimming, obviously, when you're in the locker room, you're changing into a swimsuit. You're fully exposed, at least for a few seconds, till you can get your swimsuit on.
Truthfully, the suits that we wear, right, they're skin tight. It takes you 15 minutes at least to put these suits on. Your nail beds are bleeding by the end of it because you're tucking and poking and prodding. And so, it's not enjoyable.
And if you're in the locker room with a male athlete, that person is also fully exposed. And what's happening is these colleges are allowing trans-identified males to be in the locker room with women who didn't consent to that, who didn't consent to seeing male genitalia. One of the main arguments in the current lawsuit against the NCAA is that the women were basically put in a position where they had to change in a locker room with a naked man. Attorney William Bock III said, "They're crying out for justice and the NCAA won't even talk to them. It isn't even willing to respect their concerns enough to give them an audience. So it became clear that the only thing that would have a chance of changing their policy is filing a lawsuit. The lawsuit alleges female athletes' right to bodily privacy under the 14th Amendment was violated. The NCAA authorized naked men possessing full male genitalia to disrobe in front of non-consenting college women and creating situations in which unwilling female college athletes unwittingly or reluctantly expose their naked or partially clad bodies to males. And that is a very important consideration that these colleges, these sporting bodies, they appear to ignore. They don't seem to care that they're putting women in this situation. So when it comes to these sports in particular, water polo, swimming, where you have to change into a swimsuit, you're putting these women directly in that situation where they would have no choice but to be completely nude in front of male athletes. That is absolutely unacceptable. All under the guise of inclusion, all under the guise of identity. So it appears that the club are very proud to have a trans athlete on their team. They're bragging about this athlete. This athlete received Player of the Year. They're even bragging about how this athlete is a chess champion in the women's category. And there's this lie that trans activists put out there, that this is good for women's sports. This advances women's sports. To me, that tells me that they have a very low opinion of women's sports, because they're implying that the only people who can save women's sports, who can advance women's sports, are men. So you will find that there's a lot of gaslighting, there's a lot of not living in reality, there's a lot of not applying common sense, where these clubs, who have trans athletes are proud because they want to win, because they know they have an unfair advantage. The coaches love it. They absolutely love it. All to the detriment of the female athletes. When we look back at records, when we look back at who won certain tournaments, who became the champion in 2024, whatever, we're going to see the names of male athletes. That is literally erasing female competitors. The records are not going to be held by women, and the chances of women recovering these records in the future are slim to none, because as we know, men and women have completely different bodies. What gets me about chess is if it doesn't matter whether, someone is male or female, why don't the trans athletes just compete in the men's category? Why do they go for the women's category if it doesn't matter? That's very odd to me. Same thing with pool. People were saying, well, the athlete who bravely stood up for women's sports and forfeited the competition that one time, she represents Ireland. Some people were saying, oh, well, it's just pool. There's no difference. Even though, come to find out, there are differences. There are advantages that male athletes have, even with pool. But people were saying, well, it doesn't matter. Well, if it doesn't matter, why can't the trans athlete just stay in the men's category then if it doesn't matter? Why bother infringing upon women's sports? They could have a perfectly successful career in the men's category. Paans also competed on the University of Michigan team in 2023, during which time they won the national women's title against the University of California, Santa Barbara. In the same competition, Paans was noted to have scored goals in a 17-5 defeat game against the University of Virginia, and in a 17-6 defeat against the University of Washington. So, based on those scores, it does look like this is not a prominent water polo team. So, of course, they're going to want a trans player because, this person scored the goals. And apparently this person does voluntary work related to women's issues, women's concerns. They worked as a counsellor for a women's hotline that specialised in women's health and pregnancy. I guess another area for trans-identified males to be a part of. You're calling a women's hotline, expecting to speak to a woman because it's related to women's health and pregnancy, and you may very well get a man. Remember the story I did about Lyft and their Women Connect service? So you may order a Lyft thinking you're going to get a woman, or more likely to get a woman, a female driver, and a man shows up. It's just more and more women's spaces, women only, areas that they're infiltrating, that they feel entitled to be a part of. That does upset me, to be honest, because, these are women, they're calling to receive help from another woman. I know when you call a hotline, you're not necessarily speaking to an expert, you're not necessarily speaking to a doctor or anything like that. You're calling, speaking to a volunteer who's just going to point you in the right direction. But still, a lot of women call those hotlines expecting to speak to another woman, expecting to call up and be in a safe space where she is supported by women. Many women have that expectation, and they have a right to have that expectation. But now identity is just taking over everything. It's not just sports. So this person is originally from the Netherlands and came to California to do an internship. And apparently in the Netherlands, in 2013, this person was referred to as a he. So it's not quite clear when the transitioning took place, but apparently this person is now a woman and can compete in women's sports. That's totally fair. And it has been confirmed that this person does use the female locker room. No lessons learned from what the female athletes went through competing against Leah Thomas. No lessons learned whatsoever. This is just continuing to happen. If you're a woman or a girl and you want to participate in sports in 2024, you have to be willing to share a locker room with a male athlete. You have to be willing to get undressed in front of a male athlete and to see him get undressed in front of you. That's what you have to be willing to be subjected to if you want to participate in sports, women, girls. If you want to participate in sports as a woman in 2024 or as a girl, you have to be willing. You have to be willing to be in an unfair competition. You have to be willing to go up against somebody who has a completely different body from you, who has a male body. You have to be willing to do that. If you're not, then you will essentially be excluded. And this is coming from the people who claim to be all for inclusion. They have no problem excluding women, whether it's forcing them to self-exclude because they don't agree to the terms. They don't agree to your woke terms of participation. They just want to compete against other women in the women's category. Like every other category, they expect their category to remain fair, to remain safe. Oh yeah, you have to be willing to get injured because women are more likely to get injured when they compete against male athletes. That is a fact. And we've seen more than enough examples. Examples that shouldn't exist because nobody should be allowed to compete in the wrong category. So that's another thing you have to be willing to do, ladies. If you want to compete in sports, you have to be willing to put your safety at risk, to be in a situation where you're more likely to get injured. Not just lose, not just miss out, not just have no privacy in the locker room from men. You also have to be willing to be injured, or even worse. So the mother of a female NCAA athlete who competed against Paans in the 2023 national championships, she is speaking out and her name is Jennifer, and she said, "My husband and I saw him first standing aside the pool before the University of Michigan's first game. We looked at each other in surprise and immediately knew it was a man. I observed Alicia quite a bit over the tournament, partly out of concern for the women, and also wondering how his teammates acted around him." So obviously she was concerned for her daughter, but thankfully her daughter ended up not having to compete against this person. None of these women were initially aware a man had been allowed to play. Many of the players on my daughter's team were almost in shock at the situation and spoke to one another about discomfort with it. But to my knowledge, no one spoke to the organisers of the tournament. They felt that nothing would be done, given that it was allowed based on CWPA policy. And this is a typical story. Girls afraid to speak out, girls afraid to object, because they know, number one, they probably won't be heard, nothing's going to happen, and if anything, they're the ones who will get penalised. And of course, a lot of these colleges don't even have the decency to pre-warn these women. don't even have the decency to do that. They end up with quite the shock, knowing that there's a man that they're going to have to compete against if they want to continue within the competition, knowing that one of the rival teams has a male player. Why is it always the same story? Why can't they even pre-warn these women and give them an opportunity to think about if they want to proceed? Give them an opportunity to express whether or not they consent. It makes me think that it's absolutely deliberate. It's either out of a lack of concern, a lack of respect, or that they don't want to give these women a chance to object. And before you know it, they've already competed in a competition against a male athlete. So the CWPA, they have their own transgender policy. You have to present a letter of certificate, which makes you a woman, apparently. Declaring your gender identity. You have to prove that your testosterone is under 10 nanomoles. And that is within 60 days of competition. And you do need a doctor's note to prove that you have started medical transitioning and testosterone suppression. So you're on hormones, you're proving that your testosterone is under a certain level within 60 days, and you have a certificate. That's all it takes to become a woman. An icon announced the CWPA's policy. So we had one person say, "This policy, besides unacceptable for allowing males into the women's category, excludes females from the women's category if they identify as men, which should not happen if the female isn't on a PED, such as testosterone." Wow. It doesn't end until women refuse to compete, period. I do believe once these trans athletes have to compete alone, it will stop. So far, they have women to compete against. But when that's no longer the case, it will stop. Enough of this nonsense. Protect women and girls against these men. In non-contact sports, males playing against females is cheating, which is bad enough. In contact sports, males can seriously injure women. This is a shockingly dangerous decision. These sporting bodies justify these ridiculous policies because they really see the differences between men and women as being nothing but hormones. If your testosterone levels go down, apparently that makes you a woman. If your testosterone levels rise, apparently that makes you a man. As if those are the only differences between male and female bodies. So let me know what you think. Thanks for watching. Like and subscribe. Take care of yourselves, and God willing, I will see you in the next video.